Do you remember when dating rules from the 70s could actually land you in jail today? You're probably thinking about how things were simpler back then, but here's the truth that'll make your stomach drop. Some of what passed for normal courtship in that disco-drenched decade would now get you arrested, sued, or at minimum, publicly shamed into oblivion. We're not talking about innocent faux pas or outdated etiquette. We're talking about behaviors so normalized they appeared in dating guides, were practiced at every singles bar from Manhattan to Los Angeles, and were whispered about as just how things were done between best friends over cigarettes and cheap wine. This isn't nostalgia through rose-colored glasses. This is a journey back to an era caught between the sexual revolution's promise of freedom and the patriarchal structures that still gripped dating culture by the throat. Let's start with something that happened on virtually every date. You'd be at a restaurant, maybe one of those dark steakhouses with red leather booths, and you'd feel it, a hand. Not your date's hand holding yours across the table. No, this was his hand sliding onto your thigh under that table. Uninvited, unwanted, moving upward while he smiled at you over his Manhattan. You'd freeze. Your mind would race through your options. But here's what you'd been taught. Laugh it off. Don't make a scene. He's just being friendly. This is flirting. This is how men show interest. The weight of his palm burned through your polyester dress, and you'd force a smile because making him uncomfortable would mean you were uptight, frigid, not groovy enough for the liberated 70s. Today, that hand would constitute sexual battery. That date would be committing a crime codified in state assault statutes and reinforced by the Violence Against Women Act. But back then, in those wood-paneled restaurants filled with cigarette smoke and the clinking of ice cubes, that hand was just part of the game. You'd go home, tell your roommate what happened, and she'd probably say something like, "At least he's interested." Can you imagine telling a friend that today? It got worse at the singles bars. Remember those places? The fern bars, they called them, with hanging plants and brass railings and that particular smell of spilled beer mixed with Aramis cologne. You'd walk in wearing your best Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress, your Farrah Fawcett hair perfectly feathered, and before you even reached the bar, you'd feel it. Fingers pinching your rear end, a quick grab, a squeeze, sometimes accompanied by a whistle or a "hey gorgeous." You'd whip around to see some guy in a leisure suit grinning at you, totally unbothered, like he'd just paid you the highest compliment. Your girlfriends would roll their eyes, maybe shoot him a dirty look, but nobody called the cops. Nobody even called the manager. This was the singles bar scene, baby. This was liberation. This was the sexual revolution giving everyone permission to treat other people's bodies like public property. The men doing the pinching, they genuinely believed they were being complimentary, that this was flirtation, that you should feel flattered by their attention. Some of them would get angry if you reacted negatively, telling you to lighten up, or that you couldn't take a joke. Today, every single one of those pinches would be criminal battery. Every grab would be grounds for a harassment lawsuit. But in the 70s, you just accepted it as the price of admission to the dating scene. How many times did you feel those uninvited hands before you stopped even flinching? Then there was the guy who wouldn't take no for an answer. You'd met him at a party, maybe you'd talked for a while, you'd been polite, and suddenly he was everywhere. Calling your apartment 3, 4, 5 times a day? You'd stopped answering after the second call, but he'd just keep trying, leaving messages with your roommate that got progressively more insistent. He'd show up at your favorite coffee shop, claiming it was coincidence. He'd wait outside your work, flowers in hand, saying he just wanted one more chance. This wasn't stalking. The term barely existed in legal terms until the 80s and 90s. This was persistence. This was what every romantic comedy told you to admire in a man. Remember, you'd been raised on movies where the hero wore down the heroine's resistance through sheer, dogged pursuit. You'd been told by your own mother to play hard to get because it made men value you more. So when this guy refused to accept your rejection, part of you wondered if you were supposed to be flattered. Part of you thought maybe you were being too harsh. Maybe you should give him a chance because he was trying so hard. Today, his behavior would violate anti-stalking laws in all 50 states. Those repeated, unwanted contacts after you'd made your disinterest clear, that's criminal. Harassment under Federal Code 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 2260A. But back then, you just changed your phone number and hoped he'd find someone else to obsess over. Do you remember that fear that came with kindness, knowing it might be interpreted as encouragement? Now let's talk about something that'll really turn your stomach. You were 16, maybe 17, still in high school, and there was this guy. He was 23, 24, maybe even older. He had a car, a real job, his own apartment, Your parents met him when he picked you up for dates, and they smiled, approved, thought he was mature and stable. Your friends were jealous. Here was a real man, not some pimply high school boy, and he'd chosen you. He'd take you to nice restaurants, buy you drinks even though you were underage, introduce you to his adult friends who'd wink knowingly. Sometimes his hand would wander further than you were comfortable with in his car after he drove you home. And when you'd tense up, he'd say something like, "Come on, don't be such a kid," which would make you feel immature for having boundaries. You wanted to seem sophisticated, worldly, worthy of this adult attention. So you'd let him push a little further each time, convincing yourself this was what dating an older man meant. Your parents never questioned it. His friends never raised eyebrows. Society looked at this dynamic and saw nothing wrong because you were mature for your age, and he was treating you right. Today, depending on which state you're in, this would be statutory. In California, an adult having sexual contact with anyone under 18 faces misdemeanor or felony charges, period. The law recognizes what the 70s refused to: the inherent power imbalance, the impossibility of true consent when one person has years more life experience, financial independence, and social power. But back then, these relationships were common enough that songs celebrated them. Remember Ringo Starr's "You're 16" hitting #1? Remember humming along to lyrics about a grown man and a teenage girl thinking nothing of it? What does it mean that we soundtracked these relationships with top 40 hits? The age gap thing went even deeper than you might remember. There were girls in your high school, maybe even you, who were dating men in their late 20s, early 30s. And we're not just talking about dating, we're talking about marriages, actual legal marriages happening between 13-year-old girls and grown men, sanctioned by parents and judges in states like Louisiana and Arkansas. You'd hear about it through the grapevine. So-and-so's older sister got married at 15 to a guy who was 28, and everyone would say it was because she got pregnant, like that made it acceptable. The parents would sign the consent forms, the judge would approve it, and suddenly a girl who couldn't legally drive was somebody's wife. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. A 13-year-old child still playing with Barbies a few years earlier, now cooking dinner for a man old enough to be her father. The justification was always economic or religious. He had a steady job. He'd take care of her. It was the right thing to do. Nobody used words like grooming or exploitation. Nobody talked about how a grown man pursuing a barely pubescent girl might have something fundamentally wrong with him. Today, 12 states have completely banned child marriage, and advocacy groups like Unchained at Last have exposed these practices for what they were: legalized child abuse. But in the 70s, it was just another version of normal, happening in rural communities and urban centers alike, leaving scars on girls who became women before they'd even figured out who they were as people. Did you know someone this happened to? Did you ever wonder what became of her? The music reinforced all of this in ways that seem absolutely insane now. You'd turn on your radio, maybe you were driving your Chevy Vega or lying on your bedroom floor with headphones on, and there it was. I Saw Her Standing There by the Beatles. Paul McCartney singing about a girl who was just 17 and how, "You know what I mean?" You knew what he meant. Everybody knew. Or the Rolling Stones performing at concerts where teenage girls rushed the stage, and Mick Jagger's knowing winks, his invitations backstage that everyone understood weren't just about autographs. The groupie culture wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. You'd read about it in Rolling Stone magazine, see it referenced on talk shows, hear the stories whispered and shared like folklore. Girls as young as 13, like Sable Starr, becoming famous for sleeping with rock stars, their youth treated as part of their appeal rather than evidence of exploitation. Lori Maddox claimed to have lost her virginity at 15 to Jimmy Page, who was 28, and for decades this story was told with a kind of reverence, like she'd been chosen, like she'd lived every teenager's fantasy. Only now, decades later, do we look back and see a man in his late 20s pursuing a child. We see the drugs provided to make her compliant, the isolation from parents and normal teenage life, the way fame and access were weaponized to override any possibility of informed consent. But in the moment, in that era, it was the stuff of legend. The girls who became groupies were seen as liberated, as using their sexuality for power, as participants in the revolution. Today, we'd call it what it was: adults abusing children. How many concerts did you attend where you now realize exploitation was happening backstage? The whole free love movement sounds beautiful in theory, doesn't it? Love without boundaries, sex without shame, everyone exploring their desires in some kind of beautiful, equal exchange. That's what they sold you. That's what you might have believed when you went to a commune for a weekend or attended a festival where everyone was talking about breaking free from repressive societal norms. But here's what actually happened. The sexual revolution served men almost exclusively. You'd be at a party, and some guy would use liberation rhetoric to pressure you into situations you weren't comfortable with. "Come on, don't be uptight," he'd say. "We're all adults here. This is what freedom looks like." If you expressed hesitation about a sexual encounter, suddenly you were the problem. You were repressed, you were hung up, you were betraying the movement. The emotional coercion was constant and everywhere. And the power dynamics? They were completely ignored. Jim Morrison could be aggressive and volatile with Pamela Corson, his erratic behavior framed as artistic passion rather than abuse. Rock stars could have sex with fans and call it mutual desire, completely ignoring that those fans were star-struck teenagers who couldn't possibly consent in any meaningful way to someone they idolized. The free love movement taught men they were entitled to women's bodies, that no was just a remnant of outdated thinking, that if you really believed in liberation, you'd say yes to whatever was being offered. Today, we have affirmative consent laws in states like California and New York. Laws that require explicit, ongoing agreement, that recognize a person can be too drunk or too intimidated or too young to consent. These laws exist specifically because the 70s taught us what happens when consent becomes optional in the name of freedom. Did you ever say yes when you meant no because you'd been convinced that saying no made you the oppressor? Let's talk about what happened when you actually tried to assert boundaries on a date. You're out with this guy, maybe a third or fourth date, and things are moving faster than you're comfortable with. You're parked somewhere, making out in his car. That's normal. That's fine. But then his hands start going places you've indicated you don't want them to go. You say no. You physically move his hand away. And what does he do? He puts it right back. "Don't be such a tease," he says. Or maybe, "You've been leading me on all night." There's this implication that because you agreed to the date, because you kissed him, because you're alone with him in his car, you've somehow signed an invisible contract for everything else. You're wearing a halter top and those tight Jordache jeans that were so popular, and he acts like your clothing is a promise, like fashion choices equal consent. You find yourself in this terrible position where you're physically fighting off someone you actually liked enough to go out with multiple times. He's not violent exactly. He's not hitting you or holding you down, but he's not listening either. He's treating your no like a negotiation tactic, like you're playing that game everyone told you to play, being coy, being modest, waiting for him to be persistent enough to earn the prize. And maybe part of you wonders if that's true, if you're supposed to resist and then eventually give in, because that's what every magazine article and romance novel taught you about how desire works. Today, what he's doing has a name: sexual assault. Continuing sexual contact after someone has refused consent is a crime. But back then, you'd probably just insist he take you home, and then you'd spend the next week wondering if you overreacted, if you'd given mixed signals, if you'd somehow failed at the delicate dance of 70s dating. How many times did you have to physically defend yourself against someone you'd agreed to go out with? The workplace situation made everything even more complicated, because that's where so many people met their dates. You'd get hired as a secretary or a receptionist, excited about your new job, your independence, and within a week your boss would start making comments. Little things at first, compliments about how you looked in that dress, observations about your figure, jokes with undertones that made you laugh nervously because what else were you supposed to do? Then maybe he'd start finding excuses to touch you, a hand on your shoulder when he reviewed your work, standing too close behind you when you were at the filing cabinet, an arm around your waist at the office Christmas party that lingered way too long. And if you wanted to keep your job, if you wanted that paycheck, that meant you could afford your own apartment and not have to move back in with your parents, you smiled. You tolerated it. You maybe even went out to dinner with him when he asked, because turning down the boss seemed like career suicide. Nobody called it harassment. That term was barely entering public consciousness. Coined in 1974 by a group of women at Cornell University who'd watched their friend Carmita Wood get driven out of her job by a professor's advances. Even when the words existed, nobody was enforcing them. Courts would dismiss cases, saying unwanted attention was a personal matter rather than job discrimination. The law wouldn't catch up until the late 70s. early 80s. And by then, how many women had already sacrificed their comfort, their dignity, sometimes their bodies, just to keep a paycheck coming? You'd go home to your studio apartment, maybe pour yourself a glass of cheap Chablis, and try to convince yourself that this was just how the world worked, that every woman dealt with this, that you were lucky to even have a job. Today, that boss would be facing a Title VII lawsuit. His behavior would constitute hostile work environment, sexual harassment. But back then, you just kept your head down and counted the days until you could find employment somewhere else. Do you remember the relief of finally escaping a job like that, and the sinking feeling when the new place turned out exactly the same? Here's something that sounds romantic until you really examine it. The persistence narrative. You'd see it in every movie, every TV show, every piece of dating advice. The story always went the same way. Girl rejects boy, boy refuses to accept rejection. Boy pursues and pursues and pursues until girl finally realizes she was wrong, and they live happily ever after. You were literally taught that male persistence in the face of your explicit no was attractive, was proof of true love, was something to aspire to. So when that guy from your sociology class kept asking you out after you'd said no 3 times, after you'd explained you weren't interested, after you'd started taking different routes across campus to avoid him, you felt confused. Part of you was annoyed and a little frightened. But another part of you wondered if maybe you should give him a chance, if maybe he was showing the kind of devotion that, according to every cultural message you'd absorbed, meant he was worth dating. He'd wait outside your dorm building. He'd call at all hours. He'd send you letters, actual handwritten letters, explaining in detail why you two were meant to be together, why your rejection was just fear of your own feelings. Your roommate would pick up the phone and it would be him, again, asking to speak to you. And she'd roll her eyes, but she'd also say things like, "He really likes you," or "Maybe you should just go out with him once." The social pressure to reward male persistence was enormous. Today, we call this stalking. We have restraining orders for this exact behavior. Anti-stalking laws exist in all 50 states specifically because we recognize that refusing to accept someone's no isn't romantic. It's threatening. It's a violation of autonomy. It's often a precursor to violence. But in the 70s, you were made to feel like the problem for not being flattered by unwanted obsessive attention. Did you ever finally say yes to someone just to make them stop asking? Did it ever turn out the way the movies promised it would? The dating etiquette rules themselves were designed to create these exact kinds of problematic situations. You couldn't call a guy first. That would make you seem desperate, aggressive, unfeminine. So you'd sit by your phone, literally sit there staring at it, waiting for him to call after a date you thought went well. Days would pass. 3 days was supposedly the magic number. He was supposed to wait 3 days before calling, so he didn't seem too eager. But what if it had been 4 days? 5? A week? You'd drive yourself crazy analyzing every moment of the date, trying to figure out what you'd done wrong, why he wasn't calling, whether you'd been too friendly or not friendly enough. Meanwhile, you couldn't do anything about it because making the first move would violate the rules that governed your entire social existence. Or maybe he did call and you liked him, but you'd been told to play hard to get, so you'd pretend you were busy when you weren't. You'd wait extra rings before answering. You'd decline invitations you actually wanted to accept because some magazine told you that men only want what they can't have. The entire system was built on dishonesty, on game playing, on suppressing your actual feelings and desires in favor of performing whatever role would supposedly make you more desirable. And the men were stuck in their own prison of rules. Always pay for everything, always open doors, always be the one to initiate physical contact, always be confident even if you're terrified of rejection. These rigid gender roles didn't serve anybody, but they especially didn't serve women because the rules for women were designed specifically to limit your agency, to keep you passive and reactive rather than active in your own romantic life. Today, dating apps have demolished a lot of these rules. Women message first on Bumble. Nobody waits 3 days because you'll get ghosted. People split checks or take turns paying. But do you remember that anxiety of waiting? That feeling of being completely powerless in your own dating life? Let's get darker for a moment. You're in junior high or high school, and there's this boy who likes you, except his way of showing it is horrible. He snaps your bra strap in the hallway. He trips you in gym class. He calls you names, but they're the kind of names that have a sexual edge to them. Comments about your developing body that make your face burn with embarrassment. When you tell a teacher or your parents, you know what they say? "Oh, honey, that just means he likes you." Or, "Boys will be boys." Or, "He doesn't know how to express his feelings properly." The message was crystal clear. Male attention, even when it was physically painful or emotionally humiliating, was something you should interpret as affection. You were being trained, right there in those fluorescent-lit hallways that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety, to accept mistreatment as love. Some boys took it further, pushing girls against lockers, pulling their hair, even spitting on them. And it was all dismissed with that same casual attitude. Today, this is recognized as sexual harassment, as assault, as behavior that creates a hostile educational environment in violation of Title IX. Schools have policies against this. Kids get suspended. But in the 70s, you were expected to endure it with a smile, to see it as a rite of passage, as proof that you were attractive enough to warrant attention, even if that attention felt like an attack. And here's the truly insidious part. These lessons followed you into adult dating. When your boyfriend grabbed you too roughly, when he said things that hurt your feelings, when he was physically aggressive in ways that scared you, you'd already been conditioned to interpret that as passion, as evidence of how much he cared. The normalization of abuse started young, and it poisoned romantic relationships for an entire generation. Can you remember the first time someone hurt you and you convinced yourself it meant they loved you? The free love communes seemed like utopia from the outside. Everyone living together, sharing everything, breaking free from the nuclear family structure that had suffocated previous generations. Maybe you visited one, or maybe you had friends who disappeared into them for months at a time. The reality was far more complicated than the dream. What you'd find was that free love often meant women were expected to be sexually available to any man in the commune who expressed interest. Saying no wasn't exactly forbidden, but it marked you as uptight, as clinging to bourgeois hang-ups, as someone who didn't really understand what the revolution was about. There'd be this charismatic leader figure. There was always a charismatic leader figure, and he'd have first pick of the women, especially the youngest ones. The power dynamics were never acknowledged. Everyone pretended that a 40-year-old man sleeping with an 18-year-old who just arrived, who was probably escaping an abusive home situation or looking for belonging, was somehow an equal exchange between liberated individuals. The older women in the commune would sometimes try to protect the younger ones, but they'd get accused of jealousy, of trying to impose possessive relationship models on a space dedicated to freedom. And the younger women themselves often believed the ideology, at least at first. They'd been told this was liberation. So even when they felt uncomfortable, even when they felt used, they'd convince themselves they were experiencing enlightenment. Years later, decades later, some of these women would write memoirs or give interviews describing what actually happened. The coercion dressed up as consciousness-raising, the way men used philosophy and politics to justify their entitlement to young women's bodies, the trauma that resulted from experiences they weren't emotionally equipped to handle. Today, we understand consent requires not just the absence of no, but the presence of an enthusiastic, informed yes. And we recognize that power imbalances, whether from age or status or circumstance, can make real consent impossible. But in those communes, surrounded by incense smoke and revolutionary rhetoric, you might have participated in situations that damaged you in ways you wouldn't understand until much, much later. Did you ever confuse coercion with liberation because someone called it by a prettier name? The violence in relationships was its own special kind of normalized horror. You'd have a boyfriend who'd lose his temper, who'd punch walls or throw things, and everyone would say he was passionate or intense. If that intensity occasionally got directed at you, a shove during an argument, a grab that left bruises on your arm, a slap that he immediately apologized for, you'd have very few resources. Domestic violence shelters barely existed. The first one in the United States didn't open until 1974, and there were only a handful scattered across the country by the end of the decade. Police didn't want to get involved in domestic disputes. If you called them, they'd show up, see that you were both upset, maybe tell your boyfriend to take a walk and cool off, and then they'd leave you there with him. No arrests, no protection orders, nothing. The law didn't recognize that violence from an intimate partner was actually worse than violence from a stranger because of the ongoing threat, the psychological control, the inability to escape easily. Marital rape wasn't even a crime. A husband had legal rights to his wife's body regardless of her consent, a principle that wouldn't be fully overturned in all 50 states until the 1990s. So you'd stay. You'd stay because leaving seemed impossible, because he'd apologized and brought you flowers, because your friends would say things like, "all couples fight," or "relationships take work," because your own mother might tell you that marriage requires patience and understanding. The cultural narrative around relationship violence was that it was private, that it was somehow your responsibility to manage his anger, that if you just learned to avoid triggering him, everything would be fine. Today we have the Violence Against Women Act, passed in 1994. We have mandatory arrest policies in many states. We have a national domestic violence hotline and thousands of shelters. We understand that abuse is about power and control, not anger management, and that it typically escalates over time. But in the 70s, you were on your own, trying to survive a situation that everyone around you minimized or ignored. How many women did you know who stayed in dangerous relationships because leaving literally wasn't presented as an option? But here's the thing about looking back. We can't change what happened, but we can change what we do with it. The reason these behaviors are illegal now is because women spoke up, because survivors testified in courtrooms and wrote articles and organized consciousness-raising groups where they realized their private experiences were actually shared political realities. The term sexual harassment came from women comparing notes and discovering they'd all face the same thing. The Violence Against Women Act came from activists documenting the epidemic of domestic violence. Affirmative consent laws came from college students saying enough after watching friends get assaulted at parties. Every protection that exists today exists because someone refused to accept that violation was normal. And yes, it's unfair that the people who suffered had to be the ones to fight for change. It's unfair that your pain became someone else's lesson. But that's exactly what happened, and it's worth acknowledging, worth honoring. The 70s weren't all bad. There was real joy, real liberation, real progress in that decade. But when we talk about the good old days, we need to be honest about whose days were good. For women trying to date, trying to work, trying to simply exist in public spaces. The 70s were a minefield of legal violations that wouldn't be recognized as such for years or decades to come. Every pinch in a bar, every boss who demanded favors, every date who ignored your no, every adult who pursued a teenager, these weren't quirky relics of a simpler time. They were crimes. They just weren't called that yet. So the next time someone gets nostalgic for how dating used to be, for when things were simpler and people didn't have to worry so much about consent and boundaries and harassment, remember this. Remember what simpler actually meant. Remember who it was simple for and who paid the price for that simplicity. And maybe, just maybe, feel grateful that your daughter or your granddaughter or your niece lives in a world where she can name what happens to her, where the law might actually be on her side, where the culture is slowly, painfully learning to believe women and hold perpetrators accountable. If you've enjoyed this journey back to the 1970s, if any of these jobs sparked a memory or made you wonder what you might own, do me a favor. Click on one of the cards playing on your screen to watch similar videos.